Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Payne Fund, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Bob Littman, President of the City Club's Board of Directors and a proud member. It's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Senior Partner of the law firm of Cahill, Gordon, and Rendell, and the author of The Soul of the First Amendment, Why Free Speech Matters, Mr. Floyd Abrams. There is no other topic more fitting to discuss on the City Club's 105th birthday than the state of free speech. Over the last several years, Americans seem to have a renewed interest in the protections offered by our beloved First Amendment. From speech restrictions on college campuses to censorship on social media platforms and concerns over the future of the free press, what constitutes free press speech is now routinely under scrutiny by both the right and the left. Mr. Abrams is America's preeminent First Amendment lawyer and has spoken out on the most controversial free speech issues of our time. Since 1971, when the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the New York Times and furious debate over First Amendment rights ensued, free speech cases have emerged in rapid succession. Mr. Abrams has been on the front lines of nearly every one of these major cases, which is also to say that more than any other person, he has forged this country's legal understanding of free speech, litigating everything from national security and prior restraint issues to controversies concerning the law of libel and attempts by local officials to censor art. Mr. Abrams has worked devoutly to protect the First Amendment, the crown jewel of America's Constitution. Most recently, he argued and won Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission in the United States Supreme Court. In November 2011, Yale Law School announced the formation of the Floyd Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression, whose mission is to promote free speech, scholarship, and law reform on emerging questions concerning traditional and new media. Developed in cooperation with Mr. Abrams, the Institute includes a clinic for Yale Law students to engage in litigation, draft model legislation, and advise lawmakers and policymakers on issues of media freedom and informational access. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Floyd Abrams.
Thank you all very much. I'm really honored to be here, and you should all be honored by what this organization does, its commitment to the First Amendment, and its living by the First Amendment. I was talking to Dan earlier, and he asked if I would tell a Pentagon Papers story, so I will. I was a young partner in my firm when the Pentagon Papers case arose. That was 1971, just yesterday. And it took 15 days, nothing, 15 days from the district court through the Supreme Court and the opinion of the Supreme Court. Yeah, nothing, right? And that was 1971. 4 years before that, I had traveled with a group of people to India to participate in a sort of a forum on First Amendment activities in that country and free speech activities. I had a law school friend who was an Indian princess who took me to her fortune teller. The same fortune teller, she told me, who had been the fortune teller of Mrs. Gandhi, of Prime Minister Nehru, and other leaders of India for many years. It was in downtown Delhi. It was a storefront, no furniture, a few mice running around, and the fortune teller was blind, and he didn't even move in my direction. He asked one or two questions, date of birth, time of birth, and then he spoke in Hindi to my Indian friend. And he told her various things, predicted certain things, one of which was, by the time I was 35, I would go to my nation's capital and do something that would make me very famous, he said. I thought that was very nice to hear. Came back to America, told my older sister the story, forgot the story completely. And then the Pentagon Papers case occurred, and it ended 5 days before my 35th birthday. So the answer to your next question is no, he's not available. So that's a Pentagon Papers story. I thought I would start with a little historical story first. It has seemed to me for some time now that people do not recognize how lucky we are to have a First Amendment. And by lucky, I mean not just that it's a great thing to have, but how close we came to not having one. The individuals who showed up in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, remember, had won the Revolutionary War. There were 13 states. They were under the Articles of Confederation. They were all getting along pretty well, but there was no central government. There was no coinage. There was no army. There were state armies and the like, but there was no federal entity as such. And they spent most of their time working out very important details of forming a new government. What shall we call the person who will head the executive branch? How many years shall he serve? How large must a congressional district be? What does the judiciary do? I mean, the Constitution is not a poem. It's a body of law. And it is not filled with the great revolutionary rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson was explaining to the world why the new country was being formed and the like. It is more of a blueprint than any sort of rhetorically filled document at all. And as they worked in Philadelphia to draft a constitution and thereby to give this new federal government certain but no more than certain powers, one delegate rose and proposed that there be added to the Constitution or included in it a Bill of Rights. And the states voted 10-0 against it. The other three had not shown up yet. Another delegate rose and said, well, why don't we at least say in the Constitution that the liberty of the press shall be inviolable? And the vote on that was 7-4. Another state showed up against it. It wasn't because they didn't believe in the sort of things that are set forth in the original Ten Commandments. No. It's too easy if you do this for a living to slip into that. It is our secular religious document. So it wasn't that they didn't think that freedom of speech was a good idea. It's what they did think, for the most part, that it was unnecessary and maybe dangerous to have a Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton, writing in The Federalist, said things that any lawyer would immediately get right away. And that is, if we start listing things the government can't do, we're going to forget some. People are going to say later on, those are the only liberties that exist. And it's more dangerous than it's worth to start out saying all the things we want to do to preserve individual liberty, none of which Hamilton argued it was necessary to say, because the new government was one of limited powers. Why is it that we have to say you can't limit the press when we never said you could limit the press? Why do we have to be that negative about the future? And it was only because Jefferson, writing from Paris, was very strongly of the view which he expressed in much broader terms than Hamilton. He wrote, "It astonishes me that our countrymen should be contented to live under a system which leaves to their governors the power of taking from them freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and other basic rights." And he wrote, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference." That sort of approach, not just from Jefferson, but that sort of overview, which was repeated in a number of the states during the ratification of the Constitution, where one after another delegate said, what's the problem? Why can't we say that the government is limited in the following ways? Why shouldn't we say that freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and a lot of other things are protected against the government? And of course, they wound up saying it. And Jefferson's words about not resting on inference have always seemed to me particularly important. A lot of countries around the world have constitutions. Not all of them have bills of rights. The great thing, the great protection that the Constitution gives us, I've always thought, is first of all that it's written. It's on a piece of paper. It is not just what the people thought back then and conveyed to their children who convey it as a matter of tradition. It's not just aspirational. It's not just a series of hopes about how the government would work and what sort of freedoms the people would have, which often has meant in other countries that there was very little protection. And of course, most of all, that we have treated it, for the most part, seriously, as law. In my book, I quote from some other constitutions around the world, which don't sound so bad. One of them saying the public should have the right to free speech, free press, freedom of assembly. That's North Korea. So it's not enough to have the words. You have to have a system of law. You have to have enforcement of it, and enforcement of it, again, as law, not as an essay or a declaration of why or how much we care about freedoms. And so we wound up with a Bill of Rights, and we wound up with a First Amendment. And for the most part, one wouldn't have known it existed for over the first 100 years of the country's existence. There are no First Amendment cases from the 19th century. None. There are no First Amendment cases for the first score of years. Almost, that's right, of the 20th century. It is only with World War I and the jailing of socialists and the jailing of anarchists and people who spoke against the war and cases that got to the Supreme Court that led to dissents by Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis. Only then did we start to have a meaningful level of First Amendment discussion, let alone First Amendment law. Now again, it's not that we didn't have arguments in American history before then about how much free speech ought to be allowed. Abolitionists were jailed in the South and occasionally in the North for advocating an end to slavery. And we've had throughout our history, I don't have to say, lots of instances in which free speech has not been honored. But starting in the 20th century, and I would say starting in the second half of the 20th century, we really started to have cases in the courts which resulted, for the most part, in very significant First Amendment victories. So we needed a Pentagon Papers case to say, essentially, that prior restraints, injunctions against newspapers publishing news are off the table, are not allowed. It's not an absolute rule, but it's so close to absolute that that is and has remained one of our protections. We needed a First Amendment to change our libel law in a way which allowed, in the very case the Supreme Court decided in 1964, publications like the New York Times and Time Magazine and CBS to report on what was going on in the Civil Rights Revolution in the early 1960s, because Southern white juries were simply imposing enormous judgments against the national media, to the point that at least the Times was at significant risk of its survival if it had to undergo that sort of constant litigation put before Southern juries. And that's been true in a number of different areas that we have established as a body of law enormous protection, which is unknown almost anywhere else. In my book, a lot of it is really a comparison of American law to that of other democratic countries, not North Korea, but in Canada, for example, great and truly democratic country. When Saskatchewan was about to have its high schools teach about homosexuality, someone we would probably call a religious zealot started printing a sheet of paper denouncing the Saskatchewan school system, denouncing gays, saying that teaching it is going to lead to buggery in the schools, that they're going to make everybody gay and everybody will suffer God's punishment. Well, he was charged with the crime of hate speech, essentially, and convicted and affirmed by the Canadian Supreme Court. And in Canada and in Western Europe, they not only take hate speech seriously, I like to think that we do too, but they ban it. When our president was running for office and said things about Mexicans and things about Muslims, what he said would likely have been criminal in most of Western Europe. Now, the route we have taken as a people is to say even speech which is harmful derogatory and long range, maybe even dangerous, we will generally protect. And in this hate speech area, we do so. So we have cases in other areas. I was talking earlier today about one that always struck me as interesting. In Finland. Finland is a country with deep democratic roots. I mean, so deep that when Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Finland already had a Freedom of Information Act and was enforcing it. And Finland wins the vote, usually, of journalists around the world of the freest country in the world. We don't do so well. I think they're wrong, but we don't do so well on that list because they read newspapers instead of the First Amendment. But the Prime Minister of Finland, 10 years ago, had an affair with a young woman who wrote a book, a tell-all book. The Prime Minister went to court while he was Prime Minister, and the government of Finland went to court and got a court order barring publication of the book on grounds of the privacy of the Prime Minister. That was affirmed by the Finnish Supreme Court and by the European Court on Human Rights as to anything in the book about sex or children of the Prime Minister, and what the affair, what impact it had on them, and anything about sexual relations of the Prime Minister and his then former girlfriend. I don't have to make up a hypothetical to especially these days, to give you a sense of how unthinkable that would be here, for an American president to bring a legal action while he was president to prevent publication of private, in this way, private material about him. And those are only two examples of how different we are. I want to say before we do questions, just one or two words, skipping ahead time-wise, about where we are now and some of my current concerns about where we are or where we may be. The president has at different times said a variety of things about First Amendment topics. Before he was president, he advocated changing the libel laws, he said, so that people like me, meaning people who've been falsely written about in his view, could sue and recover a lot of money, his words, and punish the press for that. When I heard that, reacting like a lawyer, I laughed. It's preposterous. For one thing, there is no federal libel law, so there's nothing to change. We have 50 state libel laws, and it's ultimately governed by the U.S. Constitution. But it is not that there's some federal libel law which Congress can go amend in some sort of way. The president has said that journalists shouldn't be allowed to use confidential sources. He said to the head of the FBI that it'd be a good thing to put some journalists in jail for publishing classified information. He said people that burn flags ought to go to jail for a year or lose their citizenship. And my reaction then was, you take him, you like him, you don't like him, that's who he is, and nothing's going to happen. I am getting more concerned these days about something happening, and in a way, more appreciative again of having a First Amendment written down as law, enforced by judges. And that comes mostly from statements the president made within the last 10 days about how maybe NBC ought to lose its license. Now, Now, he doesn't know, NBC doesn't have a license, but networks don't have licenses, cable doesn't have licenses, but stations do have licenses. And that's a big issue. I mean, that came up under President Nixon, and he made threats about license renewal being denied. And I can tell you, because I was doing work at that time for NBC, that they took it very seriously. And President Nixon sent people around from his administration to speak to the heads of the networks and warn them and threaten them with antitrust suits and threaten them with license revocations. And it had impact. Bear in mind, when we talk about licenses, we're talking about capital punishment. I mean, you take away a license from a station, it can't broadcast. It's over. So, I mean, that's a serious thing to say. It remains true. That's not the way the FCC behaves these days, and I don't really think it's going to happen. He advocated that the fairness doctrine be reinstituted. The fairness doctrine was the rule of law back then, some years ago, which basically said if a broadcaster, only a broadcaster, has someone on saying something about an issue of public importance, they have to have someone on the other side. It may sound like a good idea sometimes, but trust me, the way it worked out was that administrations of both parties used it to put pressure on broadcasters to treat them better, because the government had the power to decide what issue was being talked about and whether it was talked about enough. And finally, I'm becoming increasingly concerned about characterization of the press as the enemy of the people, which the president said. And what he said last week, it's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write. He said, you know what, I really don't want to make this a political speech. All I'm saying is that at some point, given the power of the president, any president, and the presidency, that the sort of denigration of the press on a constant basis and the threats to the press on a constant basis and the possibility of the government trying to do something about the press becomes a matter of real concern, and that is something that occurs to be more as time passes. Also, on a more optimistic level, it does tell us again how fortunate we are to have a written constitution which is law, which is enforced by judges, whatever their political party is, and how easy it would have been if we had no written constitution for any president who was really angry at the press to go do something. I mean, Jefferson had a line in a letter he wrote while he was president saying that he thought newspapers ought to be divided into three parts: probabilities, possibilities, and lies. And he said the lies part would be the biggest part of newspapers. It's not just today, but it is today, and it was then that we really needed to have a constitution. A final thought: the worst violation of free speech and free expression in American history, the single worst, came about just months after the ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that was the Sedition Act of 1798, which made it a crime to say things which were untrue, about the President, the Chief Justice, the Speaker of the House, and a number of other high-ranking government officials, except the Vice President, because Jefferson was Vice President then. So we had politics then, too. So Jefferson had a line, I thought, which I liked especially. He said, "Now, under the Sedition Act, we live under a reign of witches." So let's hope that we don't return to a time of witches. It's very nice to talk with you all, and why don't we have some questions?
Today, we are enjoying a Friday forum with Floyd Abrams, Senior Counsel at Cahill, Gordon, and Rendell, LLP, and the author of The Soul of the First Amendment, Why Freedom of Speech Matters. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you who are joining us via our radio broadcast or webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Holding the microphones today are Youth Forum Council Chair Tioli Osanya and Content Coordinator Bliss Davis. May we have our first question, please?
Please, on the situation going on in the American colleges and universities where invited speakers have been drowned out by protesters.
Right. The speech I used to give was almost only about that. Only recently have I moved to Washington and what I talk about. But it's a real problem. It's a major problem. It's not getting any better. We have situation after situation in which speakers, generally, but not always now, conservative speakers, who are shouted down, whose invitations are canceled. I mean, people like Condoleezza Rice, people of great distinction, as well as essentially racists, all of whom are protected in this country in their free speech and on campus, after campus. We've had situations in which people who were invited had to be disinvited because of threats of students of shouting them down or so. Ray Kelly, the former police commissioner in New York City, for example, appeared at Brown University, was shouted down. The mayor of Jerusalem, the Israeli mayor of Jerusalem, could not give a speech at San Francisco State because he was shouted down. And it has now become a bit more, I don't want to say bipartisan, but not just left-right, as right-wing students made it impossible for the Attorney General of California to give a speech at a California State University. Just impossible. And it's not easy for the universities to deal with. I mean, they've been too supine, in my view, in general, but we've had situations now where a university had to spend up to $600,000 for security for a controversial speaker. And our universities just don't have that sort of money. So it's going to be a continuing problem. I have to say that one of the reasons for it, I believe, is that we don't teach kids anything before they're in college about the nature of the government and the nature of the freedoms that they have in this country. Civics is barely taught around the country these days, in high schools, in junior high schools, and the like. So we wind up, with young people at college who, enough of whom, and it doesn't take a majority at all, but enough of whom are willing to vote, as it were, with their feet and their voices, and sometimes worse, to shut down speech of which they disapprove. Now, sometimes the speech is awful. I'm not talking about being right or wrong. I mean awful in the sense of being bigoted. But instead of staying away, or instead of picketing, or instead of, just being heard to say in some sort of way how awful it is, too often the interests actually of those who are speaking are served by being shut up. I mean, when you, particularly in this very sensitive area where you have pro-Nazis speaking, or others who, as to whom I must say, again, it would be illegal for them to speak in most of the democratic world. But, our choice has been more speech rather than less, and less government about speech rather than more. The price tag for that is that we allow racist speech and anti-Semitic speech and other speech which, any decent people would oppose. So it's a real problem. Long range, I think it has to be dealt with in the schools below college. Short range, I think colleges have to keep allowing speakers to appear. I should say that the Constitution, remember, only limits the government. So private colleges can do whatever they want. Most private and state universities are treated as if they were the state. I mean, all of our state universities are treated as a matter of law, as if everything they do, apart from certain academic things, but the process of disinviting people and the like, or of allowing people on one side and not another, et cetera, to speak, is something which the state can't load the dice with respect to. Private college could decide for itself who to invite, who not to invite. Most private colleges, in a generally admirable effort, have said, we will abide by the First Amendment, even though we don't have to. Again, the First Amendment is Congress shall make no law. And Congress has been expanded to mean president, the states, public officials, but never private institutions. So it is up to private institutions to make their own judgments about that. Another question?
Yes, thank you for being here. How do we educate the public to what we all here realize, that the freedom of speech is Americans' greatest privilege, it's our greatest curse, and it's our greatest privilege, where that none of us like hate speech, but we all have to tolerate it because no one has the right to shout you down to saying their rights are more important than your rights, and how do we educate everyone that these rights are equal? Like Reinhold Niemöller said, when they came for the trade unionists, I did not stand up because I was not a trade unionist. And it goes down to when they came for me, there's no one left to stand up for me. How do we tell people that if they want to enforce their rights over someone else's rights, that eventually someone will come for them?
Well, it is a teaching matter. I mean, it's a teaching matter in schools. It's a teaching matter in lower schools, as I've said. And ultimately, it's a matter of persuasion, as well as in a school situation, there are things schools can do and the like, but at lower levels at least. But I mean, there's no good answer apart from increasing and buttressing the educational process, and apart from adults being very clear with each other as well as their children about their devotion to First Amendment and other constitutional principles.
Thank you, Mr. Abrams. Could you share your thoughts about free speech or the limits of free speech, particularly relating to Richard Spencer and the march in Charlottesville and the one that's planned for Shelbyville this week, particularly when it is joined by people bearing arms?
Yeah, that's a new and obviously more dangerous aspect of this. I mean, the current law, let me say, is, yeah, there are things which constitute what we call incitement. But we have a very narrow definition. Another way of saying that is a very pro-speech definition of what's incitement. Again, we demand much more proof than anywhere else in the world about what is inciting. It has to be, under current U.S. constitutional law, the advocacy of violence or otherwise breaking the law with the intention that it will occur and the likelihood that it will occur. All of that. The reality of people walking with weapons, and particularly in states which allow public carrying of weapons, adds great complexity to the question. I think I'm answering it first legally because it's easier. Of course, there are situations where moving the weapon in a way which is directly rather than simply implicitly threatening can get you over the line into unprotected speech. But it's also the truth that the fact that the weapons are carried, even if not held in a threatening way, can be very threatening. That's a consequence, I must say, of the Supreme Court's Second Amendment law rather than its First Amendment law, its Second Amendment law about the right to bear arms. All I can say is that as a legal matter, we're going to need development of that. I mean, the ACLU is against the general reaction of people like me, but we're still shaky. The ACLU is considering its own policy now as to whether in circumstances in which guns are carried, they should represent the people who are engaging in a speech-like activity, like a march, which is protected on the public streets, everywhere. That's protected speech, and it was held protected even in Skokie back in the 1970s, where Nazis marched purposely, or made plans to march. They never really did it, but planned to march in a predominantly Jewish area outside Chicago, and it led to great litigation and the like. So I don't have an answer really about how to deal with it. Obviously, we need more protection, more police protection and the like in situations such as you're talking about. Again, I have to say that I wish instead of, and Spencer is the person, I believe, who led to the $600,000 having to be spent when he showed up to give a speech without anyone having weapons. That I'd feel a lot better if people stayed away rather than coming. But if they come, of course they're allowed to demonstrate, and they should if you're there. But it's an unsolvable question at this moment. We have to protect the security of everyone. That's an easy answer. But how far down the road we're going to be allowed to go? Can you say, for example, sure, you're allowed to carry a weapon, but not this way, or not this or not that, will be the subject of litigation in the years to come. Anyone else?
Yes, thank you. Regarding the free speech of the NFL players,
Yeah.
and also the anti-apartheid that was used against the BDS in South Africa, and now is being used regarding Palestine.
Well, remember first that, let's take the NFL. What I said earlier is 100% correct, and I'm very confident on that, which is you don't have a First Amendment right guaranteed by the Constitution to engage in the protests that the players have been engaging in, because it's private property and it's a private institution and it's not the government. That said, it seems to me it very much violates the spirit of the First Amendment, although not the law, for players to be punished or not rehired or otherwise barred from expressing themselves in a peaceful manner. And I would hope that the NFL would not yield to the president on this. The BDS issue is take a little more time than I have right now, except to say that forgive the legalistic stuff now. I think it's perfectly constitutional for a state to say, as New York has, if you boycott Israel, we can boycott you. We don't have to deal with you if you act in a way inconsistent with what we believe are our values. B, I think it would be unconstitutional, I know it would be unconstitutional, to take steps which effectively bar people from demonstrating for BDS-related causes or almost any other causes on campus or elsewhere. And the more complicated things would take too long. Yeah.
Mr. Abrams, thank you for your zealous advocacy with respect to the First Amendment all these years. And we really are grateful to you, especially here at the City Club. I do wonder if in Citizens United, maybe your zeal went too far. But I'm interested specifically.
I thought I could get out of here.
Well, and specifically, and correct me, I think the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination has been held not to apply to corporations, but only to natural citizens, right? That being the case, if that is constitutional, why then can't we say logically and properly that the First Amendment protections apply only to natural persons and not to corporations?
Well, for one thing, you'd lose freedom of speech for all the means of communication from which you now get your news. They're all corporations. The New York Times is a corporation. Chicago Tribune's a corporation. PBS is a corporation. All of them. I have to say, I've spent most of my professional career, long before Citizens United, making First Amendment arguments for corporations where no one imagined that they would not have First Amendment rights. I represented Barnes & Noble when Ken Starr subpoenaed them to answer the question of what books did Monica Lewinsky buy for Bill Clinton. And Barnes & Noble, a corporation, said we shouldn't have to tell you what books are purchased, and the government shouldn't make us have to answer the question of who buys what book in our bookstore. And I've represented commercial entities like Standard & Poor's just a few years ago, when the Department of Justice, or I should say when first a decision was made by S&P to downgrade the United States, which it did in terms of its bonds and the like, and which still is in effect. That was a subject of great concern by President Obama, by Secretary of the Treasury, by the stock market, and the like. We argued when the government later brought a lawsuit against S&P, but not against other rating agencies, that it was brought in retribution, that the reason they chose S&P was that it had downgraded the U.S. The government was outraged. That case was later settled. The government was outraged and worked very hard answering our arguments and saying it literally wasn't true. But the one argument they never made was S&P is a corporation. How does it come across talking about retribution, violating the First Amendment? Because we do have a body of law which keeps the government from acting to punish you for exercising your First Amendment rights. And the law is and has been that these ratings from a commercial entity about other commercial entities are protected by the First Amendment. So it didn't take much for me to think in the way that I do about Citizens United. Imagine, a conservative group prepares a documentary denouncing Hillary Clinton at a time when she was the most likely Democratic candidate for president in 2008, running against then Senator Obama. But she was expected to get the nomination. They prepare a 1-hour program denouncing her, very unfairly in my view, but denouncing her. They want to put it on pay-per-view. Under the law as it was then, if they did it within 60 days of an election or 30 days of a primary, it would be a crime because that organization got some of its money from a corporation. That's what the Citizens United, those were the facts of the Citizens United case. And my view was that I thought it was an easy case from a First Amendment perspective. How in the world can you keep them from putting on, an ad, as it was, or whatever you want to call it, a denunciation of a presidential candidate? I mean, Michael Jordan had a very famous line when he was asked why, when he was a player, he never took positions on social issues. And he said, Republicans buy sneakers too. And I think that's what is afoot with respect to why American corporations, who, believe me, spend a lot of money to influence everything. I'm really not denying that, on lobbying and a wide range of other things, but not what Citizens United allowed. It is not that they're pouring money into presidential elections. They're just not doing it. And indeed, a lot of the corporations liked the law that my side got stricken in Citizens United because they wound up under pressure from both sides to give money. They don't even get credit because they give to Democrats and Republicans, so no one's going to be angry at them. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking with it.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum with Floyd Abrams, Senior Counsel at Cahill, Gordon, and Rendell, LLP, and author of The Soul of the First Amendment, Why Freedom of Speech Matters. Today's forum is sponsored by Ulmer and Byrne. It's also part of our Authors in Conversation series, supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. We appreciate your support of City Club programming. Today's forum is the Samuel O. Friedlander Forum on Free Speech, made possible by generous gifts from the friends of Mr. Friedlander and his daughter, Nina Gibbons. We welcome Nina and her husband, James, who are here with us today. Thank you for joining us. We welcome guests at tables hosted by the ACLU of Ohio and the Cleveland Foundation. Additionally, we welcome students from Cuyahoga Heights High School and Flow Homeschool Co-op. Student participation in City Club forums is provided by many foundations, including the William W. E. Weiss Foundation. We thank all of you for being here today. And this brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Mr. Abrams. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Payne Fund, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.